Good afternoon, Father's House Church. I'm Gordon here with another episode of Beyond the Message, where we dive deeper into the message from Sunday. I'm joined today by Jordan.
Hi, guys.
And that's it. It's just the two of us today.
Holding it down.
But
Jordan and Gordon.
Jordan and Gordon. That's got a good ring to it.
It does.
But I think we'll be okay. Pastor Pierre gave us a lot to talk about on Sunday, so
Yes.
I think we'll be okay. Continuing the Unseen Anatomy series, talking about silence. Something kind of not what you want on a podcast, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Jordan, how good are you at not talking?
I'm great at not talking. I am like, at this point in my life, I'm 100% okay. Like, I'm one of those people, I can be on the phone, and if there's a weird silence, unless I'm busy and it's like, okay, like, I need to go if you're not going to say anything, I am fine with just let it be.
Yeah. And what about with God? Do you feel like you're able to, because obviously that was the real point of the message, right? Not to not talk around other people, but to allow for that silence so that you can sort of hear God, essentially, and connect with him.
I think I'm fine. It depends. If I'm anxious in the time in which I'm coming to God, depending on what the circumstances, silence is harder. It's more of, it's a discipline no matter what, but if I'm coming to God and I'm feeling off about something, it is a little bit more challenging. I find that when I do create room for silence in my prayer time or my quiet time with God, I definitely have to keep my mind, like, it's really a discipline. I have to keep my mind from thinking of the next thing I have to do. I really have to train myself to, like, be still. I can't do that when I'm tired or laying down because it's over. I'm going to be asleep in 2 seconds.
That's the peace of God just
like,
coming upon you, you know?
That's not the point, though. Like, I don't want to fall asleep. But yeah, that's a long answer to your short question. But I think I'm okay. It's a discipline, just like a lot of things spiritually. It's all, you got to train yourself to keep doing it.
Yeah. I'm good at. I'm not good at silencing my mind, I think, is where I kind of come down on the idea of silence. And it's difficult to, like, it's easy to just kind of, like, pray in silence, but then you run that risk of your mind kind of taking your thoughts elsewhere. And especially if you're tired or, like, just waking up or just going to bed, you're going to be thinking of whatever you dream of. I don't know, having those. So that's kind of where I struggle. Like, it's easy for me to just sit and not talk, but what am I really accomplishing with that silence? What outwardly looks like silence, is that really silence? That's kind of where I'm working on myself a bit, and trying to go find God and hear from him. But it's an interesting kind of thing that Pastor Pierre was talking about this. I know this is sort of later, but we're talking about silence. And, he said, I forget his exact quote, but essentially the point was we find God in silence. And that's, like, usually where you can actually hear from God. And to me, that just speaks towards that perspective shift that I think we all need to have, because it's never that God is not there or that God is not talking. It's just that we are not listening or looking for him. And it's, I don't think you need silence to hear from God, but I think that's a good way of kind of conveying, like, especially if you're not hearing from God, right? You got to stop to be just aware that he's there. What do you think? Do you kind of relate to that a bit, or is it more that's not something that, like, because it's easy to get caught up, right, in life. I think that's the big point of silence. And I know Pastor Pierre was talking about that too, like the, where is it? Yeah, silence is the disruption to the demand of life, he said. And I thought that was a good kind of way of phrasing it.
And that's when he talked about prayer, right? That's when he was talking about Daniel praying 3 times a day, where it's like, I'm willing to disrupt whatever is happening, whether it's work, whether it's talking to somebody, whether it's whatever, to be intentional and getting in God's presence and quieting myself. And honestly, when I hear you talking about how easy it is to get caught up in the demands of life, I think of Mary and Martha, where Martha in that situation was the one who was caught up in the demands of life. She was cleaning, and it's so crazy because she meant well.
Right.
She wasn't filling her time with things that were unproductive. She wasn't filling her time with sinful things or things that are wrong to do. She was trying to prepare and get things ready for Jesus. But the whole time missing the fact that, but Jesus is here.
Right.
Like, he's in front of you. You just need to stop for
Yeah.
a moment and, you know, I guess be like Mary in that situation, which she was at his feet. So.
Well, and in that situation, that's like a literal acting out of the idea, because Mary was actually just listening, right?
Yeah.
She was literally silent and listening to Jesus. But when you talk about Martha, I mean, there's so much to that, because we bring so much of our own thoughts into our walk, and it's so easy for us to kind of override God in a sense. Like, no, I'm doing something good.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying this is the same thing, but there is that other parable of the people who come to God and say, like, oh, we've did so much in your name. I don't even think it's a parable. I think it's just Jesus saying, like, you are going to come to me and say,
Right.
oh, we did all this in your name. And Jesus can say, I don't even know you.
I don't even know you.
And I'm not saying that's comparable. I don't think Martha was not a follower of Jesus in that moment. But I think you can kind of extrapolate that out where, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And understanding the importance of doing the things you're called to do, whether you understand it, whether you agree with it even, whether you even think it's right or not. And I know that that's something that we don't really talk about a lot these days, but it's like, you have the truth of the word. You can think it's wrong. You can think it's not right, like at a moral level, but you are wrong. Right? If you either have to accept, like, I don't understand this, but I trust God in it,
Yeah.
or I don't. And then if you don't, it's like, that's between you and him. You're gonna have to figure that out.
Work that out.
And I mean, luckily silence isn't something to that level, but that is one of those things. And it's like, these are the things we need to be practicing to really understand. And this gets back to really the core of Pastor Pierre's message, which is like, in this whole series, right, is knowing yourself, who you are, not based on, that was another thing I really liked was, it was Eric Rogers, who was on the podcast, I believe, before Father's Day. I called him out, at least during first service, which is when I was at church, saying like, oh, he's a great guy, he's a good father, or whatever. But those are just descriptive things.
Yes.
So do you know God at a descriptive level? Do you know yourself? And we, I think, are prone to know ourselves on a descriptive level. Like, I'm quiet, I'm shy, I'm outgoing, I'm whatever I am. But we don't know ourselves, which is like, I'm a child of God. I'm I'm made in his image, renewed by his grace, like called to follow after him and all these other things. And then same with God, like we can describe God, but we don't really know him at that level.
Yeah. That was good. He did it in both services. I sat in second, and he called out another Eric. He called out Eric Rollins during second service, and then he even talked about Marlise. He was like, I can give you a bunch of descriptions about Marlise, but you don't know Marlise until you spend time with her.
Yeah.
Like, that's not going to mean anything to you until you are intentional and put in the effort to know her for yourself. And it's the same with God. It's like, we can read the word and see all of the different things, or even go to church and hear a pastor preach about God as a provider. God is, full of mercy, and he's gracious, and he disciplines us, but he does so in love, and he's trustworthy. You can hear all of that, but it's not going to mean anything if you don't know him and have a relationship and experience that for yourself. And that takes intentionality. Like, that takes putting time in. That takes like doing what Daniel did and saying, I'm going to stop and I'm going to get in his presence.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I like that too. Is at the end, it was kind of like his closing point, was that we fight what we haven't practiced. And I think that's so true. I think it's so easy to lose sight of kind of what really happens with salvation, and you are born again. And Jesus talks about having the childlike faith, and it's because you are a child, you know, and you have to grow. And just like any other habit or thing that you've done, like it requires that work initially. And it is counterintuitive.
No, forever.
Well, right. But I'm just saying, especially initially, right?
Right, exactly.
Until you've really worked that muscle, so to speak, up. And I think we get that kind of false idea. You know, I know we talk about that a lot of like, oh, just because you're saved, life isn't going to be perfect.
Yeah.
It's not about that. But I think the same kind of expectation we place on Jesus, where it's like, oh, it feels so good to be saved and to know him. And it's like, but does praying for half an hour feel good? Like, honestly, no, not all the time.
No.
You know, especially when you get into like I don't want to say actual prayers, but like the
real stuff,
the David prayers,
yeah,
you know, of like,
yeah,
I don't know, the hard stuff. And so that idea of practicing and really understanding all the different practices that go into it, and that silence is part of it. That there is, because prayer is in a sense like a conversation that we're having. And if you're not leaving God space to speak, you are missing out on a key part of the thing you're doing.
Yeah. Amen.
Okay.
Word and amen. I do want to go back to one thing you said, though, because it made me think of something another pastor said, and I was like, oh, my gosh, mind blown. But it was the simplest thing ever when we were talking about, like, the intentionality. And you mentioned, especially during the hard prayers, I agree. But I would also say sometimes it can be hard to pray when life seems like it's going fine.
Right.
Because it's like, I don't have this urgent need. I don't have this catastrophic, God help. You know what I mean? It's like, but I still, even in those moments, need to work this. I need to be intentional. It's not, you can't stop. Like it's progressive. As long as we're on this earth, we have to keep seeking his face or we're drifting. And it made me think about, this pastor was speaking like in a relational context, but he was like, you don't always have to do the bad thing in a relationship for it to die. If you just do nothing,
right,
it's going to die.
Right.
Like, we are created to die. Life itself takes intentionality. Intentionality and maybe in what we eat, intentionality in what we drink and how we, if we exercise, if we don't exercise. And it's in every area of our life. It's like life and living takes intentionality. If we do nothing, it's going to suffer just like if we do the bad or wrong things, if that makes sense.
Oh, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Like, oh my God. It was so simple, but I didn't think of it that way. And it certainly holds true for our relationship with God.
Yeah.
It's like, just do nothing. Like,
right.
You don't have to necessarily be sinning.
No.
Just do nothing. And your relationship with God is going to suffer. You are going to drift more and more. You're going to hear him less and less. And it's,
And it's such an interesting thing. This kind of gets to like the core, I don't want to say issue, but one of, I think, the real core struggles of faith, because there's always that tension of God is and can do all things, and so don't take that away from him, but stop acting like you don't play a part in it,
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're talking about. Like, God lets us be the gatekeepers of our relationship with him. He does not impose himself on us. I don't know what the term for that. I know that like the silent treatment, we give God the silent treatment. I don't know what the opposit of that is. God does not give us the oppressive treatment, or I don't know, whatever that would be.
He doesn't force.
Yeah.
Himself,
And so it's easy to lose sight of that, because it is easy to say, like, God is great. God can do all things. Like, he's got me. And that's true. But at the same time, what are you doing to get close to him? What are you do?
Yeah.
Don't lose sight of the responsibility that you have to maintain that relationship, and that understanding that you are the one charged with maintaining that relationship and making sure that you are going to him so that he can grow you. It's kind of a weird, because like children, right? My daughter is going to grow up, whether I'm there or not, whether I help her or not. She is a human being. She is going to age. Time is going to go on, But spiritually, you can stop yourself from growing. And we hear that in Hebrews about how it's assumed Paul wrote Hebrews. Paul is saying that you should be eating meat now, but you still need milk. Like you don't even understand the core principles of your faith, and yet you've been technically in this faith for so long. Like, what are you doing? You've neglected your relationship. So you still are an infant, and that is not healthy. And it's about kind of understanding that. So this whole we're really talking about this whole series. I know this sermon, from yesterday, was kind of focusing specifically on silence, but we're kind of really talking more about sort of the whole point of it right now, which I think is good. But yeah, and that is such an important thing to kind of understand, like you were saying, is that relational aspect of it, and just how important we are in that relationship, without getting prideful, and that's where the other side of it is. But that's kind of the core, is like you have to understand that you are responsible for your relationship with God. He will do the work of growing you, but only if you do the work of going to him.
Yes, if you let him.
Yeah.
And when you desire something, which is why this all goes back to the heart, which is why it makes sense that it's in this Unseen Anatomy series, because you don't see that stuff. You don't see your heart. But it's like when you desire something, you move towards it. Like, you are intentional. And so when we get to this point of like, God, I actually desire a relationship with you, know that it's going to take work and it's rewarded. His word literally says he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Like, that's what his word says. So he acknowledges it. He blesses us. He blesses our family more than us by our faithfulness. But it's work. Like, you have to invest in it, and you have to be intentional and really look at like how you're spending your time. If it's, if it's not necessarily praying 3 times a day like Daniel, or he said David did it 7 times or something. Yeah,
one of the two.
It's still like you need to make that time in your schedule for God and be intentional and keep that, like commit to that.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier, is like, you can make whatever, I think this was last week, CJ was saying this, right? You can make whatever justification you want for your actions, but that does not hold up as far as like suddenly making the action good.
Yeah.
So you might have a great reason for why you did what you did. And I think that, again, is what, and this is where it gets back to the milk versus meat thing, right? If you understand the truth of the calling and the truth of the word, and like understand that foundation, then one, you wouldn't be justifying those actions because you would have, that you didn't do it right. I think it all kind of
repenting.
Yeah, it all kind of stems from this lack of understanding, because you don't have that firm foundation. So then you go do something maybe you shouldn't, or misfocus it, and then you justify it thinking that you can justify it. But you're totally missing the point of like the holiness of God and how much bigger he is, and that sin and whatever does not fly, like no matter how you justify it. And that's the point of Jesus, is that like there is no justification. If you don't do the right things, you cannot justify yourself. And none of us can, because we're all unrighteous. And so that kind of leads into the to why we need Jesus and why we need to know him and understand that. Because I think, and I think that really can come out in those silent moments, because silence to me, and I know Pastor Pierre was kind of talking about it before we had that like 2 minutes of silence, is that kind of, it allows for that contemplative, reflective time, because there's nothing distracting you except, again, yourself. But in a perfect world, it allows you to kind of reflect and say like, where am I?
Yes.
And where are you? And why are we not in a relationship, right? Why are we not closer? Where you been? What have you been up to? And sort of see that mirror in a sense.
Yes, absolutely. If you feel uncomfortable, ask yourself, why am I feeling uncomfortable? Being silent and listening to God. Like, yes, it creates nothing but space for you to kind of reflect and see, where am I? Like you said, emotionally, where am I mentally? Yeah, 100%.
And could you just pull the mic a little closer?
I sure can.
Thank you. And this kind of gets, back to, again, what Pastor Pierre was talking about, this idea of having that desperate need for God. And again, we see it, right? In the New Testament, in Jesus' life, all these people coming to him for healing. And you don't need to explain why they have a desperate need for God.
Yeah.
But that need does not stop once we find him. And this kind of gets back to what you were talking about, of prayer and like thankfulness are some of those things where it's kind of counterintuitive, that it's harder to do the better your life is. Like giving is harder to do when life's not going great.
Yeah.
Because like I have less, so I'm really trusting God because whatever. But prayer and these spiritual disciplines, and like the discipline actually comes from the high times.
Yes.
And regardless, understanding that we constantly have this desperate need for God is something that, again, I think really again is exposed in that silence.
Yeah.
When you really are taking that time to just kind of, contemplate doesn't feel like the right word, but I can't think of another one. So I'm going to say contemplate like God and how awesome he actually is, and how really insignificant we are, and that really, I think that kind of, it's the opposite, but like the enormity of God fills that silence, I think, if you're really focusing on him during it. And I think that really gives you that sense, and is one of the better ways, short of like a life crisis. I think those are the two places you really find that desperate need for God.
Yes.
Obviously, if like you are in like a life-threatening, relatively situation, it doesn't have to be physically life-threatening, but like it feels that bad, right? That's when we have a desperate need for God, because we're actually desperate. But then also in that silence, you get to feel that, like, again, the enormity of God, and just like, oh my God, I get it, right? Like he fills emptiness and silence, and like, what does that even mean? But you really get that sense for, this is so much more than me, and I need that. I don't know if you kind of felt that or got that. What was the silence like for you? Because we did a couple minutes of silence at the end of church.
Yeah, so the second one was fine. The first one, because I sat in second service and he was silent in the beginning, I wasn't ready for it. I knew it was coming at the end. So that one actually kind of threw me off, and I felt I was battling anxiousness, to be honest, in that moment, because I'm like, what is happening right now? Like, why am I feeling a little bit anxious? And I think it's really just because I wasn't ready. I didn't think it was going to happen, like, in the beginning of second service. Like, he literally said the word silence and just was silent. But the second one was fine because, again, I knew that it was going to happen. But to kind of go off of what you said, where it's like, yeah, you have that desperation when you are actually desperate. But then being silent and how it creates space for you to realize how big God is. I think it also creates space for you to remember. And I think the last time I was here with Carrie, we talked a little bit about how important it is to remember what God has already done for you. And so I think in moments of silence, that can help cultivate gratitude, and it can help cultivate this realization of, first of all, you've been faithful, you've covered me, and I continue to need you.
Right.
I don't deserve it, but you choose to love me because of who you are, because of your mercy and your goodness. You created me in your image. So I think when you are in those moments of silence, it gives you space to remember how faithful God has been. as well as, of course, meditating on his word. And that in itself will create like a gratitude in you, and then you'll desire it.
Right.
You'll desire silence and spending time with God because it's filling you. Literally, that time is filling you, and you leave better than you came. You have the potential to. Again, if you're able to settle your mind and you're able to actually be present with God, it fills you in a way that other things cannot.
Right.
And so while it's still a discipline, it just like, well, I like feeling that. I like remembering that. I like being in your presence. So you're, hopefully more willing and more likely to stick to that discipline.
Yeah. Well, and I thought too, it's funny because you say that, and then Pastor Pierre talked about Elijah, right? God rains down fire.
Listen.
And then like the next day, Elijah's like, I can't live anymore.
That's the power of fear, though, honestly.
Well, I'm just saying.
A fear it can drive a whole nation to destruction.
No, absolutely.
We've seen it.
Yeah, yeah.
So that really is, because it wasn't just he did that, and what caused for him to get to that point was it Jezebel? Is that the wife's name? Was that the wife's name?
Yeah, I believe so.
Or she had a Jezebel spirit or something.
Something like that. Well, I think that's where it comes from, right? Her name is Jezebel.
Like, she terrified him. You know what I mean? So it's like he was shook. Elijah was shook. So go ahead. What were you saying?
Well, I was just going to say that kind of carries forward into, I think that's another thing that maybe can hold people back is that thought of like, oh, this is still hard.
Yeah.
It's always going to be hard.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to say it. I don't care how good you think it does. It is a good feeling.
Yeah.
But even me, and I'm not saying I'm anything special, but if I'm talking about having these disciplines, you would hope that I have the disciplines. So that's all I mean when I say me. And even me, I'm like, I can go a day or two sometimes. Like, oh man, have I no. And I'm, but it's like, why not? I don't know.
Yep.
And I know I need to, and I know that I want to, and yet I still don't sometimes. It's like, what? But that's exactly that Elijah moment, right? Because I'm sure in that, upon reflection, Elijah's like, yeah, I do know that. I shouldn't have been afraid. But just the busyness, the noise of life, no matter who you are. And that's why I love Peter so much, because he's just the worst. He does that, like every opportunity he gets, he does that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's just great because he is so impactful and important, and God uses it. And that kind of helps me at least be like, God, it's not about me, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to get to heaven and God's going to be like, well, 7, however, you missed, if you had just one more day, if you just prayed one of those days that you missed, you missed the count, right? Yeah, you would have. It's never about that. So you don't let those feelings of like, oh, this is what I should be, or this is what, and even that, again, the Hebrews verse, like if you feel that way about yourself, like, oh yeah, I should be eating meat right now, but I still don't understand like the basic stuff. That's not something to feel shame about.
Yeah.
It's not something to like, that's what the devil does. He comes in and says like, you should really hate yourself because of what you've done.
Accuser of the brethren.
Yeah. Whereas God is like, no, I love you. I forgive you. Let's try again.
Yeah.
Let's just keep trying. Let's keep going.
Yes.
So don't let these feelings and those thoughts, and this kind of gets back to actually how Pastor Pierre opened the message, which is this idea of like how we will project our perspectives onto each other's perspectives of us.
Yeah.
And I think these kinds of things is where it really can get you, because you have those thoughts of like, well, if anybody really knew how bad of a Christian I was or whatever. Yeah. And it's like, that's not, don't think those thoughts. Nobody would think that. It's that, and that's what keeps you from even being open about it with yourself, with God, with your pastor, whoever you can go to talk to about the stuff. Yeah. So again, that's just that. Don't let those thoughts or feelings, if anybody's listening and feels that way, like don't let that get to you. Just be encouraged that like God is still with you. He still loves you, and he just is calling you. Yeah. So it doesn't matter that you didn't hear his call yesterday. Like he's calling you today.
So answer.
Right. And that's why, and now, so like, that's where the silence comes in, right? Like, don't worry about it.
Oh, that's a word, Gordon. That is such a word. Because, I mean, he talked about comparison a little bit, too, and, like, the shadow self, which is what you said. Like, ooh, if they really knew,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Oh, I would be ostracized or whatever. And it's like, yeah, it creates shame, but it also delays obedience. And ultimately, that's what God wants. That's how we show God our love, literally by doing what he tells us to do.
Right.
And so he doesn't get glory out of disobedience, no matter what the reason is, whether it's fear, whether it's, you know, thinking what will other people think, or projecting our thoughts on other people and then it coming back, you know, whatever. And we all do it. Like, I do it. We all do it. And it is a fight. It's a struggle. And I wrote down a scripture.
Oh, nice. Let's hear it.
That I thought of when I was thinking of this, because I literally wrote down, he said, perceptions and comparisons. And I wrote down, what will people think? And it made me think of the scripture in Proverbs 29, verse 25, fear of man will prove to be a snare. The Message translation says, the fear of human opinions disables, but trusting in God protects you from that. And so I guess that's exactly where my mind went when I listened to the Message again and he started talking about how destructive comparison is and that perception and what will other people think, and letting that weigh on what we do when God tells us to do something. So yeah, no, it will disable. It will keep you stuck. Yeah. It will keep you stuck.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, we let that, well, and I know that this can even be a problem for personal relationships, you know, and churches as well. You know, it's like trying to, it's tough because you have different, because this gets kind of back to what CJ was talking about with his message, you know, and that like code switching, of like, well, this is the situation I'm in. So I do want to, in a sense, like act appropriately, to go back to that, but at the same time, like not to the level that I sacrifice, and this, again, kind of what we were talking about last week, sacrifice the truth of who I am and who God is just to appeal to you. Yeah. And that can be such a fine line, that it's tough it's easy to miss sometimes. And you kind of, but I think it's just another thing that we grow in, of like, okay, maybe, but that requires self-reflection, because self-awareness, even with what other people think, right? Sometimes somebody will tell you what they think of you and they are correct. You know? So that's not like, there's a difference between doing what you know is right, regardless of what people say, and not even being open to, maybe I'm wrong, and being able to reflect. And again, that's where silence comes in, because that silence is where we have that time of reflection, right? And that's where God really does kind of search our hearts and say, like, it lets us in that silence think like, yeah, did I do that? Was I really acting correctly, or did I represent God well? I thought I did, but did I? And
do you mean like, because I feel like I'm abstract and I don't know if I'm thinking what you're saying. Do you mean like, if the Lord, you know, you see something that's maybe wrong and you call it out, but maybe you could have done it in a different way? Like, is that what you mean? Like
that, or just even how you carry yourself, right? Okay. So you might, again, like do something or act in a way that you feel like you should or had to, or I don't know. Okay. Just anything, right? I've had that happen. I remember I was talking with kind of like a mentor of mine about some situation that happened with a friend of mine. And this gets, again, I felt really justified. I was like, because we had like, I wouldn't go all the way to argument, but we had a disagreement. It was a impassioned disagreement. Okay.
You had some sauce in it.
Exactly. Some heat. And I was explaining it to this friend of mine. And I was like, so it's whatever, blah, blah. And at the end, he's like, so are you going to apologize to him? Yeah. I was like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Did you not hear what I just said? And it was that, but that was to me, that's a great example of what I'm trying to say, because I did have to sort of go back and think like, is he right? And if I just kind of blindly was like, I don't care what anybody thinks, I'd be like, I don't care what you think. Yeah. But there is that time where sometimes what people think is godly. Yeah. Because that's kind of the other part of this, is like, yeah, we all have our own relationships with God, but we have relationships with each other that should be God-driven. And so I had to kind of go back and reflect and think like, man, and that's where it's tough because it's like, I don't want to admit that he was right, but he was. And I did end up apologizing. And, but it's those kinds of situations where, and this sort of gets back to what we were saying initially about just really having that understanding of like, what am I called to be? Mm-hmm. Who am I called to be? Mm-hmm. And what does that entail? And sometimes that entails doing stuff that like every part of my humanity says,
Absolutely
forget that,
not.
right? Like never. I'm not going to do that because
Mm-hmm.
it's wrong. Mm-hmm. And still, I mean, like there is still that part of me. It's like, I was right.
Yeah.
But that doesn't matter. Like you can think you're right and society might agree with you that you're right. But like if God disagrees with you, that is not a good place to be. And you have to be able to acknowledge that. Like everything in me is saying like, be proud about, like, hold on to this. Yeah. But God is saying like, let it go.
Absolutely. And
again, the situation could be different. But as far as what I was just talking about, that I think is a good example of kind of from my own life of what that looks like.
Yeah. So silence helps with surrender as well.
Yeah.
So it's not just, what I hear you saying is it's not just, you know, yeah, you learn God and it's a discipline, but it's like silence, you can wrestle that.
Yeah.
Like that's a safe space. In silence with God is a safe place to wrestle. Like, but I'm right. And it's like, okay, but the Holy Spirit is convicting you still.
Yeah.
And you get to this point where it's like, okay, I'm going to make a choice. I'm either going to continue to fight and wrestle against you, God, or I'm going to surrender and do what you say to do. And yeah, silence creates a perfect space for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think just again, because it is that relationship but God is not a person. So like he won't butt in. Yeah. Sometimes he will. That's maybe too broad, but it's that silence where you really get that true feedback. Yeah. And depending on the situation that can run that range. But yeah, silence is definitely important, and it's silence, like mindfulness, meditation. That's always like a, I don't know, hot button word, because like meditation, right?
Yeah,
it has that connotation.
A lot of definitions for meditation in today's world.
Yep. But there is a godly Christian form of meditation.
Absolutely. 1,000%.
And I think to me, the three of those, like mindfulness, silence, and meditation, sort of all move towards the same goal, because it is that like reflective time where you're reflecting, but you're not the one doing the reflecting or causing the reflection. God is, and you're just kind of allowing him to work in you in that silence.
You said there's a godly form of meditation.
Yeah.
Expound.
Oh, gosh.
For the people.
Well, again, for me, it's just meditation, I think in general, is just that like focusing on something. And so if you're meditating, you should be meditating on the word or on God. So whether that be on specific verses, just kind of thinking through them, what do these words mean? What is it truly saying? Topics, again, thankfulness. We were talking, at least again in the first service, Pastor Pierre was talking about that with the silence. It's just like every breath, just think like, thank you for that breath. But that is in itself like meditation, because you're just focusing. It's really just about forgetting what else is going on and focusing on a very specific thing. Yeah. Again, usually in silence, because it's like an internal thing. But I think that's one of the better ways to kind of, again, connect, because that's where you sort of hear from them. So, yeah.
Cool. Who's in the chat? Or what's happening in the chat?
Not much.
Okay.
But we got Isaiah 30:15, and quiet and confidence shall be your strength. So, some good words. Great points.
That sounds like a scripture.
It is. That was Isaiah 30:15.
Oh, okay. I thought you were saying like a person's handle.
No. It's just we just have Beatrice.
Okay.
My mother is in the chat saying
hi.
hello. Yep.
Hi, Mama Gordon. That's an excellent verse. Yes.
Yeah.
Amen.
Do you have any other did you have anything you wanted to touch on that we haven't yet? I see you got all your notes and prepared.
I have two thank you cards. No, I think that's it. I touched on the little bit of things that I wrote. I encourage everyone. He, in both services, talks a lot about Daniel. So I do encourage people to definitely read the book of Daniel and get a better understanding of what they had to face in Babylon and how they tried to assimilate, which is a lot of like basically what our culture does today. It tries to assimilate us, and he even said that into the way, the way of the world. So I definitely would encourage, as we get on this podcast every week and say, you got to read the word, you got to read the word. And sometimes it's, well, where do I start? Where should I read? Read Daniel.
Yeah.
Read the book of Daniel. Hear about Daniel, hear about the 3 Hebrew boys.
Yeah. And have that time of silence this week.
Yes.
I think that's a good challenge for the week. Doesn't have to be long. I think that's kind of the other pitfall that a lot of people fall into. One is that like setting higher expectations for where you should be at this point. But the other is like not setting realistic expectations. Because I think I'm going to read my Bible 45 minutes a day. No, you're not. Just like read a chapter. And
if that, depending on how long the chapter is.
Sure. And
you have to know you.
Right.
That goes back to you really have to know you, because what you don't want to do, and I'm sorry to cut you off.
No.
Is try to be overly ambitious, and then you get defeated. Right. And then, like I said earlier, the enemy is the accuser of the brethren. He is going to try to talk you out of something you are barely, you're already barely, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. No,
it's so easy to be discouraged, especially before that thing becomes a habit. So you really have to know you and set realistic expectations and commit to that.
Yeah.
Commit to whatever you choose, commit to it.
And be forgiving of yourself when you miss because you're going to, trust me. I mean, we all do. Everybody's Pastor Pierre still does. I guarantee it. If he was sitting here, he could tell us. I don't want to make him sound terrible, but he would be able to tell us stories, right? Yes. Yeah, he has the same stories of like, oh yeah, I went a day or a week or I don't know. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's been there. We've all been there. Everybody will be there. But yeah, and as far as reading, I like what you said. Like, personally, I think it's good to read a book of the Bible. I know there's like a lot of daily devotionals, and I think those are good too, but I think if you're like really trying to read the word, it's good to like read a book from start to finish over however long it takes, but because it keeps you in it, right? That's important to have that context. So
absolutely. Yeah,
definitely read Daniel. That's a good challenge. We'll talk about Daniel next week, maybe. We'll read Daniel.
We got Pastor Rob coming. We're gonna talk.
That's true.
See what he's talking about with the physical.
Got to do some
body.
Push-ups before next week. Maybe I shouldn't.
Jumping jacks.
Yeah, I shouldn't be hosting next week. We'll get a healthier.
Heart rate up.
We'll have a healthier host next week. But thank you, Jordan, for joining me and talking with me today. Thank you in the chat for being here. Everybody for watching. We will be back next week with the final. I almost said episode, with the final installment in the Unseen Anatomy series.
Okay. Claim it.
We have prayer tomorrow, 6:30 a.m. in the Fishbowl. Yes. Hope to see you there. I don't think we have any other events. I'm sorry if we do, but we will see you on Sunday for sure.
And Sunday night we have the block party.
Yep, Sunday night.
To end July off.
That's going to be exciting.
From 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. So, yes, bring your family, bring your neighbors, invite folks.
Definitely. And we'll see you on Sunday, and we'll see you next Monday for another episode of Beyond the Message. Be blessed, church. Have a great week.